So welcome. We're here to present managing vSphere 6.0 deployments and upgrades. My name is Dilpreet Bindra. I am the Director of Engineering for vCenter, and I've been with VMware 9 years. So.
Yeah, I'm Mohan Pateri. I'm an architect, and I focus on vCenter. So I've been with VMware 5 years.
Great. Before we get started, why don't we do a little question? We're mixing it up a little bit. How many of you plan to move to 6.0 in the next 3 months? Oh, okay.
60%.
That's a fair amount. How many within the next 6 months? Okay. And then how many within the next year? Okay, so the majority 3 months. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get started now, and standard disclaimer applies. Everybody's talking about this disclaimer. I'll move on. Okay, what are we here to talk about? vSphere 6.0. Mohan, introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, you did.
We did.
Okay, sorry. What we're here to talk about, jet lag is still. Is part one of a two-part series about deployment and upgrades. The first part is around vCenter server lifecycle. We're going to do a couple of product walkthroughs for install and upgrade, and then we're also going to talk to you about what you actually should be thinking about in terms of deployments, the deployment models, because there's a fair amount of change between 6.0 and in 6.0. So when you move from 5.5 to 6.0, you should be able to understand those changes and also be able to model those and determine how you want to move over to 6.0. The other thing is that there's a number of gotchas that we've captured in this deck so that you know what to look out for when you're moving over to 6.0. So fair amount of content here. What we'll try and do is save of around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. If you have to leave early or you don't want to stick around, I'm perfectly fine with folks dropping off questions at the stage with a piece of paper and your email address, and we're more than happy to respond to you via email. Okay, why are we here? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the enhancements and features in 6.0 for vSphere, but we're only going to touch upon them briefly and then move on to how do you, in the next 3 months, which is the majority of you, get to vSphere 6.0. Specifically around how you sit down and plan through what you need to do to be able to get to 6.0, and then what options you have for installing and upgrading your 6.0 environment. Again, as I mentioned, deployment models and best practices. Okay, so as we were going and working on 6.0, our real goal in the engineering side and our product management side was to deliver an enhanced customer experience, and specifically around deploying and upgrading. We've known it's been a challenging area for our customers, both for vCenter as well as for ESX, and we were looking to make a measurable difference in 6.0, and then also beyond. It's a journey, really, but 6.0 does pay a huge down payment on this journey, and you'll see some of that here. Okay, we'll talk 6.0, vCenter 6.0 enhancements. So as you know, we have two different platforms that we support. There's Windows, that has been our traditional platform of choice, and then we have our virtual appliance, which is becoming our platform of choice, right? If you look at 6.0, we've actually achieved parity on all performance metrics with the appliance, with its embedded database. So it's a fairly significant achievement. This makes both platforms equivalent from both performance and scale. And in the next slide, I'll talk to you about how it's equivalent in also functionality. So from 5.5 to 6.0, we've changed a few things. But enhanced link mode is where Previously in the appliance, you couldn't get link mode because we used Active Directory as the replication technology to be able to do link mode. In 6.0, you have enhanced link mode, which gives you the capability to do link mode with the appliance. It changes the replication technology so you don't have this very difficult configuration that you have to do with your Active Directory server, which can be cumbersome and tricky. And then it also starts replicating some new data across all the linked VCs. So it's a fairly significant feature. It's also very easy to use now. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you get there when you deploy your 6.0 environment. Okay. One of the key things that when you're looking at deploying to 6.0 is that the vCenter 6.0 components, previously in 5.1 and 5.5, you had a myriad of choices of installing all of these components together or separately, and you could end up with 7 different installations if you wanted. We are becoming a little bit more prescriptive in this release, and specifically there are two components. Those 2 components can be together as an embedded, with each other, or they can be deployed separately, but they're not 5 or 7 different installations. There's just these 2. And so vCenter Server includes all the components that are related to VC, and then Platform Services Controller, which we'll introduce in more depth in a second, it contains all the common capability that we have, that we rely on, and we'll go into a little bit of depth on the Platform Services Controller. Okay, deployment models. So in 5.0, we had no SSO. It was all authentication based on vCenter, and extensions connected directly to vCenter and got their capability of logging into vCenter and doing a bunch of work. In 5.1 and 5.5, we introduced single sign-on, and in the first release of single sign-on was in 5.1. In 5.5, you had the second release, and as we showed there in the graphic, you have many different ways of installing all these different pieces of the puzzle, including the web client, the inventory service, and so on. In 6.0, we have this Platform Services Controller that I've already mentioned, and it's no longer just single sign-on. It contains a whole set of common services that we utilize across all our virtual centers. Single sign-on, licensing, certificate authority, certificate store. Some of these are new services for 6.0, and then service registration. And so this is the node that makes up what would replicate all the content for our link mode setup. So if you had multiple vCenters connected to a single PSC, you would get a link mode configuration, and that's the data that they would end up sharing. The PSCs can also be linked together and replicate to each other, and this is similar to what SSO used to do in the past with replicating across SSO nodes. It's now just being done for all the services that are part of PSC as well. Okay, deployment models. As I mentioned, you can have an embedded deployment model with PSC and the vCenter services all in one. And the benefits of this are really the ease of use. You don't have to manage a separate VM. You don't have to manage another service. So the ease of use is the key on the embedded. As you go and have more and more vCenters in your environment, you may choose to go down the external PSC path. And the benefits here are enhanced link mode, which you get if you have an external PSC, and PSC-HA, where you can configure the PSCs to be able to replicate to each other and behind a load balancer, so that you would have high availability between all the PSCs that are talking to your vCenters. We also have 2 supported platforms, as I mentioned before. They have some value in each of them, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We have the vCenter server appliance, which is simplified deployment. It delivers a clean backup restore story with VADP. It has no more Windows licenses, no more external databases, and really tries to drive down your total cost of ownership for your vCenters. For the Windows platform, it's the existing platform that you've all been using and working with up until now. It supports physical host deployment, which the appliance does not. And then it has an external DB that you can connect to, whether it's SQL Server or Oracle. We recommend you move to VCSA as the platform of choice moving forward. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Mohan now to talk about install.
So before we start on install, a question I have for all of you. When you go from one version to another, do you usually upgrade or you install new and move over? How many of you install new and move over? So 30–40%, okay, pretty good. So let's get started. So with install, right? So what we had before, let's talk about the history of our installer, right? So we used to have, in 5.5, for example, a simple install and a custom install. And we didn't have too many tweaks to it in the sense that you are forced to, in a simple install, you're forced to install in a particular way, and you can choose your ports, your paths, and all that. So that was a big problem we heard from our customers. And so in 6.0, we made a lot of changes, and you'll see that as we go through this. So we have a vCenter installer for Windows and a vCenter server appliance install. The workflow for both of them is pretty much similar, very similar. And so we, as part of this install process, we're going to show you a demo as well to show you how the install process is pretty streamlined. As Dilpreet had mentioned, we want customer experience to be really good. This has been a challenge for us in the past. We want to make sure that it's easy for you to upgrade, and an upgrade should not be a nightmare like it in the past it could have been. So, right. So for installer for Windows, so we have one installer. You choose the deployment type. The deployment types are embedded or external. So those are the 2 options you had in the deployment models that you saw. So you choose between one of the 2, and depending on which deployment type you choose, the workflow would change a little bit, right? And then important thing about the installer is, as you go through the install, it's going to validate. Do you have the required things in the back end? Do you have enough resources? Do you have the right kinds, the DNS and other things? It's going to check everything ahead of time. So while you go through the installer, it's going to validate. So after you hit finish, there's no surprises. You can just go take a coffee break, come back, and your install is done. So that's kind of a big improvement. And so the pre-check functionality, like I mentioned, is very important. So we check everything ahead of time, and then so that there is there's no issues where you are halfway through the install and things break. Okay. So the other aspect is we also have, like there are a lot of customers who deploy a lot of vCenters. They need automation. So we have a JSON-based installer for that. So you can use a scripted CLI to run the install. The appliance pretty similar. It's as you would see, the install, the workflow, the look and feel is pretty similar to for what you had in Windows. You choose the deployment type. You validate all the data ahead of time. But one important caveat here for the appliance: in the past, you could have used IP address and deploy. No longer the case. You have to have the name. You have to plan ahead. You have to have the name of the vCenter ahead of time, registered in DNS, forward and reverse. Ahead of time, you need to make sure that you have details about your NTP servers and other aspects, so that as we go through the checking process during the upgrade, we're going to validate this. If you don't have the name on DNS, you can't install. So you can't even proceed. So it's very important that you plan ahead, set up your DNS, NTP, all that correctly, and then you go ahead. And then the most important decision you have to make is, what is my deployment type? There are two deployment types. What is the decision matrix behind that? Embedded you will use when you have a small environment, only one vCenter. You don't want to talk to anything else, you use embedded. If you have a lot of different data centers and you want all of them to share data between them and have an ability to have a single pane of glass, you go external. External also gives you high availability. So you choose ahead of time, and then once you choose that, your install becomes much easier. Right? Here also we have a scripted CLI, and we support multiple platforms for install. And you use that when you have a lot of, you're a big provider and you have a lot of vCenters to deploy. Right? So let's go through some best practices on installation. So sizing, right? Sizing is very important. Sizing for appliance is actually done by as part of the installation process. But what if you have a Windows box? You need to make sure that your Windows server has a required CPU, memory, disk that is needed for that particular, the type of vCenter you're installing. So it's very important that you do your sizing correctly. Make sure you look at our documentation out there to make sure that your hardware or your VM meets the requirements for sizing. Then the other aspect is, if it's Windows, you need to make sure that you have the right OS that is compatible and the right database that's compatible. You need to check to see if there's any DSN requirements, and if the DSN requirements, the driver requirements for SQL, for example, all those things you need to validate ahead of time. Fully qualified domain name, important. DNS, we really validate this, because without this the installation cannot proceed properly. By having a fully qualified domain name, a lot of the challenges of people using IP addresses and things breaking go away. So we really insist on you using a fully qualified domain name. And then for VCSA, one thing we want to mention is the target of your install. If you are using before 6.0 U1, 6.0 U1 we released a few weeks ago. Before that, your target had to be an ESX box. You cannot install it on a vCenter before. You have to point it to a ESX host, give the credentials of the ESX host, and that's how you would potentially install in the past. But now with 6.0 U1, we support vCenter as well. So I would recommend, if you're going to go to 6.0, obviously you go to the U1, because we have a lot of enhancement, and a lot of the gaps that we initially had when we released 6.0 is no longer, has been addressed with 6.0 U1. Time synchronization, very important. So as a lot of things like authentication and other aspects use time as a major component, you need to make sure that all your components, all your VMs, it could be, if it's embedded, just one VM. If it's external, there's a lot of VMs. So you need to make sure that all of them are able to talk to each other, right? And then on the network side, forward and DNS, reverse DNS, very important. And if you're deploying in 6.0, we need to make sure that, if you're using VDS, you need to have an eFormal port. And the last but not the least, routing, right? If you have, let's say you have your PSC and your vCenter on different VLANs, you need to make sure there's proper routing and gateway and all set up correctly. So those are, but pretty much a lot of these are common sense stuff, but you know what, you need to go through all of these, do correctly for the install to proceed smoothly, right? So now we will go through a demo. This demo is actually there online itself, in the sense the feature walkthrough.vmware.com it's a click-through demo, is where you as a user can go in there and click through the process and actually go through the entire demo at your own speed. But for this presentation, what we have done is I've done the click-through demo myself, and then I've recorded it as a video so that it just flows, and you see how streamlined it is and how an install process works. And in our case, we're going to install an appliance, right? We're going to install a vCenter appliance, okay? And we're going to have an external platform services controller. So here we are kind of launching the media, going through the installer, and then we go through the initial process. First, we're going to install as part of the install. Since we're choosing an external platform services controller, we are installing the PSC first. And as you go through the process, since we've decided that we're going to have an external, we're going to go through the workflow for that. So here, these are like typical things you guys are probably used to already. The name, the password, root password, and other aspects you choose here. You go to the next step where there's further validation. You would choose the type of install next. So here you see that we're choosing, since we're going to go external, we are going to install the platform services controller first. Then we proceed. So we'll have to go through two different workflows. First is the PSC workflow, and then followed by the vCenter workflow. Then we're choosing the appliance size. The appliance size here, it says 2 vCPU, 2 GB memory. We're choosing the data store that it's going to go on. We're going to say, these are the network settings. We validate those network settings, and then we finish the install. So this is the PSC. So the PSC install is proceeding. PSC is the first step. If you're having external, you have to do PSC first. When you do embedded, PSC happens first, even if as part of the install process. So the PSC installation is complete. Now we're going ahead and going to do the vCenter install. Similar steps here, and we talk about the VDS. In case you have VDS, you need an ephemeral port. And then we go through the typical validation here. We authenticate, and then we choose, since we already have a PSC, we're choosing a vCenter over there. And then we choose this is the sizing. We choose the size of the vCenter. Then we're using an embedded database. We can also use an external Oracle database for an appliance, but in this case, we're using embedded. We're validating all our input, and we're going through the deployment process. So it is pretty streamlined. You do these things correctly, it's going to install without fail. There's no ifs and buts here. So that's kind of one of the important criteria here. And here, once the vCenter is installed, we're logging into the vCenter to make sure that's up and running. If you look at the version, this is 6.0. So with this, I'll pass it back to Dilpreet to talk about upgrade. Upgrade's a lot more complicated.
It's fun. So vCenter Upgrade, I think we'll talk a little bit first about how you go through planning an upgrade. And it's not just about vCenter, of course, it's about your entire environment, right? And we're concentrating on vSphere here, but we have some links on KB articles, which will come as part of this slide, to talk about your entire, like, well, how do you stage out your entire upgrade, right? At least for vSphere, you would start with SSO first, and then vCenter. Then you do your ESX upgrades, and then your virtual machines and your other ESX-based features, you would then upgrade later. But as you go through, the ordering is extremely important for the entire virtual stack if you have a lot of solutions on top. So I highly recommend going to this KB article to be able to determine what, and it's actually very well written to key off of, based on what you have in your environment, what sets of things need to happen first, second, and third. Yeah,
I just had a question. How many of you, are immediately able to upgrade your vCenter, all your vCenters together? Do you have challenges when getting, if you have a lot of vCenters, do you have challenges in, doing it in a very short period of time? And how about also ESX? How long, within 6 months? The poll I can have is maybe how long, within 3 months or 6 months, are you able to get all your infrastructure, all these things done? Is the question I have. How many of you can have that capability? Okay. How many of you leave the ESX, keep the ESX in the old version for a long time? Okay. Thanks.
Okay, great. It's also very important for you to spend enough time thinking about the hardware capabilities and compatibility and interoperability that you have for all the solution stack that you're working off of. It's also very important for software compatibility. If you're using Windows, which does the next release support the Windows that you're on, do you have to go through a Windows upgrade as well as part of the process? And we'll talk about that in one of the gotchas that I have in this deck. And then also understand your virtual machine upgrade requirements. If you're going to go and upgrade to the next hardware version, does it satisfy or does it help you in the rest of the virtual machines that you have, or do you have a guest tools upgrade that you need to do, and you need to make sure that the guest tools support the guest OSs that you have in your environment. So it's important to look through all these details. Also, don't forget about the web client plugins, add-ons, various other solutions you may be using, because as you go, you probably want to make sure that your favorite plugin to vCenter, it has support for 6.0 before you actually go and migrate to 6.0. So please, you should probably look at that as well. So approach upgrades with a holistic view of your virtual infrastructure. Again, this whole path, the good news about this is that there's key milestones here where you don't have to do all of this together. You can actually stage it. So you can do a set of your infrastructure within a certain time frame and then upgrade that and then move on as you go along. So you don't have to do this all at once. But it's very important to look at the entire environment and figure out how do you move the entire environment to the next version. Okay, vCenter Windows upgrade. This is a screenshot similar to what Mohan showed for install. It's also a very similar workflow. vCenter Server Appliance upgrade is same UI, but you would click through the upgrade button instead of the install button. And you would get your standard disclaimers and so on, and we'll talk a little bit about this. And you'll then be able to pick up the source vCenter and then be able to migrate that source vCenter to the other system. I do want to point out a key distinction between, I don't know if a fair amount of you, how many of you have used the appliance already? Okay, good. That's a good smattering. There's a very big distinction between the way we do upgrade for VCSA and the way we do upgrades for Windows. VCSA upgrade keeps your current VCSA essentially untouched. It still requires a downtime window, right, where you would actually take a maintenance window and then do this upgrade. But it migrates your existing VCSA, installs a new VCSA on the other side, migrates all the data over, and that's now your your upgraded VCSA. For Windows, you upgrade in place. So one of the benefits of doing the migration-based upgrade is that you actually are able to go back to your previous appliance whenever. If something went wrong during the migration or some issues happening, that appliance is always there for you to actually go back to. The only caveats are that you have to have enough resources, both in terms of networking and your various hardware, to be able to stand up another VC to be able to do this migration. For vCenter Windows upgrade, again, it's in place, but it's non-recoverable. So meaning you have to, and for both, I would highly recommend backing up your environment prior to doing the upgrade. So, and for Windows especially, because if you want to actually get back to your previous version, you would need to do a restore from your backup. Okay, upgrade paths. Now, this is all the supported upgrade paths that we have for 6.0. For vCenter Windows, we do support 4x upgrades, but it's a multi-step process. So you would go from 4x to 5x to then to 6.0. For 5.0 or all 5x releases, it'll upgrade natively. For VCSA, there was no 4x release, so we don't have to worry about that one. But for 5.0, we are not supporting the upgrade from 5.0 to 6.0. But from 5.1 U3 onwards, it's supported natively. Okay, I'll walk through a little bit of the upgrade scenarios. Some of these may look very similar. There are some distinctions, so I'll try and highlight them as I go through. So vCenter 5.0 upgrade, you didn't have a single sign-on, so you actually get to choose which deployment you want to do. Do you want to go to an external PSC, or do you want to do an embedded deployment, embedded upgrade? So in this scenario that I'm showing here is the embedded case, where you would point to this vSphere 5.0 environment, and it would essentially upgrade you from what you previously had in vSphere 5.0 to the 6.0 environment, and it would look very similar in that it's all embedded. If you were doing an external PSC, and I don't know why that's running off the screen, but if you were doing an external PSC, then you would have to deploy a PSC first. So you would first have to go through the step of deploying a new PSC, and then upgrading the vCenter server, and then connecting it up to the PSC. So as you go through an upgrade, you would be asked for what your PSC information is. You would enter it in, and it would make sure that it upgraded and got you to that external PSC. Okay, for 5.1, it's very similar, but you did have a SSO node there, and that SSO just becomes your PSC essentially. And this is an embedded upgrade, so we upgraded. And the key thing here is there was an SSO DB in 5.1 that is no longer there in 6.0. So what you would have to do is manually clean up the SSO DB. So it was part of the SQL DB in 5.1, so make sure you remember to clean that up. Okay, vSphere 5.5, it just upgrades directly to 6.0. It looks very similar, and the architecture is essentially unchanged for the embedded. I'll pause for photographs. Okay, 5.1 or 5.5, where you had the opportunity to install a bunch of components externally. So you could have potentially a situation where these 4 components were installed separately. As we go through the upgrade, what you would end up having is you would first upgrade the single sign-on to PSC, right? And it's backward compatible, so you don't have to worry. This wouldn't be a breaking step, so you don't have to do all these steps together again. So you upgrade to PSC, and that could continue working for a while like this. And then you decide, okay, I'm going to upgrade my vCenter, and it would go to your vCenter server. Again, we would bring all the components back together that were installed separately. For folks that have used, how many of you use link mode today? Okay. I'm hoping more now that we have enhanced link mode. But if you have previous link mode and you're connected up to Atom, what you would first have to do is remove the vCenter instances from link mode. So you would remove them from Atom, and then you would install a PSC node. Again, we're replicating via the PSC node. That's why we need it external, and that's why that's what's replacing Atom. So you install a new PSC node. You then upgrade the vCenter instances, pointing to the new PSC node, and you essentially have link mode back again with no hassle of dealing with an external entity. Best practices, they're very similar to the installation best practices. Sizing, again, it really, really matters. I would highly suggest you spend a little time. The sizing requirements for 6.0 are more than for 5.5 and 5.1. So please be aware of that and understand that you may have to resize higher prior to doing the upgrade if you're on Windows. So just make sure you size appropriately prior to the upgrade. And for VCSA, you have the t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large, tiny, I think is also one choice. Also check for Windows OS and DB compatibility. We talked about that earlier. We have deprecated VCSA, the Oracle DB support for VCSA. So if you previously had an external Oracle for your VCSA. We've announced deprecation. We haven't said which release, but it's likely that it would be the next major release. But it continues to work today. It's just we've announced deprecation. Again, back up your DB and your VM prior to upgrade. Stick to the recommended topologies. This is also a great KB article that sort of highlights the topologies that are recommended for vSphere 6.0. And again, network is really important for you to spend some time on so that you don't have a glitch. When we've done this with other customers, networking turns out to be the hardest problem. Firewalls and so on that cause us a number of problems when we try to do an upgrade. So spend enough time making sure everything is connected up the way you expect it to be. Did you guys want time to take? Okay, I see a photograph there. Okay, great. Time synchronization, Mohan mentioned this. Again, use NTP. We highly recommend it because you won't be able to authenticate with your system if your vCenter has a time skew greater than a certain amount with your SSO. So you will lose the capability of logging in if you don't take care of this. So we highly recommend you using NTP for all your systems. Okay, so as I mentioned, you may have to move to a new Windows OS as part of this. I don't think, so for 6.0 we don't support 2003 anymore. I don't know how many folks are still on Windows 2003? Good, okay. Maybe we don't have to worry about it. So if you want to upgrade your operating system to the latest Windows, you have two choices. You can go ahead and upgrade your Windows first and then upgrade to 6.0, or do the upgrade to 6.0 and then upgrade your Windows. That's kind of what that says in more words than I really needed. But be careful, make sure that you back up your environment prior to doing this, and make sure that the OSs that you're moving to or from are supported by the releases that you're either on or going to, depending on which choice you take. Database compatibility, so in Microsoft SQL Server supports a compatibility mode, and if you use that compatibility mode, it can cause problems for our upgrade logic. There's a KB article on this particular problem and how it tells you how to get around this problem. But it will mess up our upgrade logic because our upgrade logic will query the DB for what version it is and so on to be able to check if the DB is compatible. So just make sure you read this KB article if you use compatibility mode. If you have any of the characters in your database password that are mentioned up there, it will also cause us problems. So make sure that your password for your database is void of these characters. Okay. Phones are down, so I'm ready to go. Okay. DSN compatibility. Make sure you upgrade your DSN as well so that it's compatible with 6.0. That's also very important. You will get a recording, and I think the slides do go out as well. There is potential for leftover components. I mentioned this earlier where you would have a SSO DB that you would have to clean up. There is potential where, depending on how you dealt with your system in 5X timeframe, where you could have potentially gone from an embedded scenario where your SSO was local to your vCenter and then decided later on that you wanted to move it external or point to an external SSO. You could have ended up in a situation where that SSO on vCenter wasn't cleaned up properly. And so that will also mess up our whole, upgrade logic. It will think you're actually embedded and try to upgrade the SSO that's on that vCenter server rather than the one that you're actually pointing to, which is external. So just make sure that you don't have any of these lingering components lying around when you go ahead and do your upgrade. Okay, we have a fair amount of resources online. I also, Mohan and I put together a really nice reading list of really good KB articles that sort of call out all of what we have at the end of the presentation. Okay. So we'll do a demo just like we did for install. And this is an upgrade from 5.5 to 6.0 with an external SSO. And this is the Windows platform. So we go to the install image, go ahead and run the installer. So we're first you go through your EULA and you sign into your single sign-on, and then it's running all the pre-upgrade checks. And you get to go ahead and reconfigure your ports if you like. And then it's asking you where you would like to install your various components, which directories. So it's first upgrading the platform services controller, or the SSO to the platform services controller. And now the platform services controller upgrade is complete. Now we will go through the vCenter server upgrade. Again, you come to the same install screen. Click through the EULA. You give it your credentials, and then you register your single sign-on with you validate the certificate that you get back from single sign-on. And then, again, you get to configure the ports for VC as well. And then, again, the directory locations for where you would install all the VC bits. And then you just go ahead and click upgrade. It upgrades the product. And then you launch vSphere Web Client at the end. And again, I think this, okay, it didn't show there was 6.0, but believe me, it was 6.0. Okay, we wanted to introduce a couple of, I definitely want to look at time, but a couple of things that we introduced in U1 as part of 6.0 U1 that we wanted to touch upon briefly. One is repointing. So a lot of people have asked us in the past, how do you go from, if I deployed an embedded appliance or embedded Windows, and how do I actually go to, and later on I decide to have more VCs, or I want to do link mode, how do I get there? So we released a tool in U1 that allows you to repoint your vCenter to an external PSC if you choose to later on. If you didn't do it during deployment time or upgrade time, you can do it as using this tool later after the fact. So here's an example. You have a vSphere 6.0 deployment that you did. It's all embedded. So the first step would be to make sure you upgrade to U1 first. And after upgrading to U1, you would use the tool. First, you would deploy a PSC node, external PSC node. And then the tool will allow you to replicate the two PSCs to each other for a period of time. And then the repointing will allow you to repoint to that external PSC and clean up the PSC that's on your system right now as well. So you would end up here. And here's the way the utility looks. It's just this is the appliance version of the utility, but the utility exists for both. And in U1 as well, we actually introduced a new management UI for the appliance. And this is just a quick look at it. So again, it's the previously, and for folks that are on 5.1 or 5.5 appliance, it's the same 5480 port, but it looks dramatically different, and you get access to, the summary, the health, and from this basic page, do a bunch of management actions that you would do, including the time synchronization, network, so on and so forth. So this is all available in the appliance. And you can also do your updates from this UI to the appliance, and it'll let you know in this UI when there's an appliance update available. And you can check for updates. You can figure out the settings for when you go about doing your upgrades for the appliance. Or where do you point to? Because you may not want to point directly to VMware.com, so sometimes you can set up a mirror and then point this to the mirror instead of to our site. There's also a PSC Management UI in U1, and for this one it would be whatever the PSC node's IP address or FQDN was. It could be if it was an embedded PSC, that would be the same thing as the VC FQDN, and then /PSC. And it would look like this. You would have the capability of managing your users and groups, various configuration, look at your certificate store, your certificate of authority, and change a bunch of these configuration options, including your password policy directly from here. Also, Active Directory configuration from here as well. Okay, additional reading material. Some more?
It's a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Mohan is going to take us home.
So in conclusion, so hopefully we've shown you that 6.0 is a kind of has a lot of compelling features, capabilities, and also the install and upgrade is not too hard for you to do. So we have identical installation for Windows and VCSA. You have multiple streamlined options, so the process is pretty much bulletproof in the sense you are able to check ahead of time before you go through the process and not have too many failures through the process. And then we have also shown you a lot of different deployment topologies, embedded, external, and then there are other presentations in VMworld that we have where we talk about high availability. So there's one session on that. You can look at it later, or if you had attended it. So follow those, then you should be good, and your vCenter environment should be pretty stable and not something that should be a concern for you. Last but not the least, the U1, right? We had some gaps in 6.0 when we first released it. So with U1, the repointing feature is a very important feature because we tell customers if you want certain features, you have to go external, and if they embedded, they couldn't do that before. So it's very important. And the management UI gives you more capabilities to manage your stuff. So now I guess we'll open it for questions.
Before we do that, mics are going to be going around, so we'll try and get there. Make sure you take the survey after the presentation, and if you have any questions that we can't get to, please leave us a note, and with your email address we'll get to it. The other thing is on Twitter, it's just #INF4944 if you want to tweet the presentation.
Yeah.
Do we have a mic somewhere?
Yeah, he's...
In relation to an upgrade, how do the SSL certificates come across in a Windows box, and how do the components fit in?
So I didn't completely understand the question.
So during an upgrade,
Yes.
if we've got custom SSL certificates being used, how do the SSL certificates upgrade, or how are they pulled across into the new components?
So we take the existing SSL certs directly from whichever deployment it was. If it was Windows, it's in place. So we then put the custom SSL certs into the correct location. So we're not trying to change that. If our requirements change from release to release, our requirements in terms of the type of certificates may change, and sometimes you have to go and reissue the custom SSL certs as part of that process.
Two questions. First one, can we assume from your comments that the Windows version of vCenter is going away? And the second one is, any plans to bring Update Manager into the appliance?
Update Manager, absolutely. It's on the top of a very short list of things that we have to get done immediately. As far as Windows, we recommend VCSA.
So we hope to take you in that direction, and if we are successful, then yes.
Hi, you mentioned the possibility of pointing to an external PSC from an internal. Does that include pointing from an internal embedded Windows PSC to an embedded Appliance PSC?
We do not recommend using embedded PSCs for replication at all. So because of that, it has to be external. You can go from a Windows to an external appliance-based PSC, no issue with that. It's just that it has to be external.
We're trying to be very prescriptive about the topologies so that we make sure that they're fully tested. He needs a mic again, sorry. Oh.
Windows physical server to the appliance, and I don't necessarily need an external PSC at all.
Okay. So that's a really good question. I thought it would come up earlier. We are working on a migration tool for migrating your Windows environments over to VCSA. And so that migration tool will cover all the various topologies and so on as well. And we're trying to accelerate that. We do have a fling out. So if you guys want to play with the fling is actually fairly useful, but we don't recommend you use it in production. But it's a good place, a good way to try out. But we do have that. Again, that's part of that very short list of things we have to do immediately.
That's one of the reasons I polled you guys on who builds from scratch, right? If you're building from scratch, it's easy. You just build it on. Right, yeah, if you have dependencies, it's hard. If you don't have too many dependencies, it's much easier.
More questions? We have a question over there as well. If we can.
The VCSA is based on Linux OS.
Yes.
The security patches of the Linux, are they embedded in upgrades, or do you have the management of Linux yourself?
We manage the security patches for you. Okay. So the security patches for both the appliance as well as the application stack would come directly from VMware. We're also trying to make sure that we, as we move forward, accelerate the high severity security patches both for the appliance as well as for vCenter. vCenter ships a lot of their own bits. They don't rely on the OS bits. So it's very important that you get both.
So our goal is to make it like a black box so that you don't really have to deal with that level.
Hi, if I decide to migrate to new, for a short period of time I'm going to have 2 vCenters. What's the position with licensing in that scenario?
That's a really good question, which I don't have an answer to.
We don't. 60 days. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I don't think eval would apply because you'll have production workloads on both vCenters. So.
Yeah. Actually, if you leave me your email address, I'll get somebody to answer that question for you. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.